If you want to support independent content like this show, the PlayStation podcast Sacred Symbols, the Retro podcast Knockback, and more, and get perks for doing so, please consider subscribing to Colin's Last Stand on Patreon at patreon.com/Colin's Last Stand. Your support is essential. Thank you. Whether we like it or not, our consumer escapist goods no longer maintain a strictly physical presence. Resistance be damned, the future of home entertainment is increasingly becoming digital. We've seen this endlessly over the last decade as music, movies, and television have jumped the digital divide. A not so complicated feat when even the tiny devices in our pockets can effortlessly beam pretty much any content directly into our lives. But as gaming begins to test the waters of a streaming future, it's time to question if our infrastructure is yet ready for an entertainment medium that requires much faster, stabler speeds, especially here in the United States, but certainly elsewhere in the world as well. This is an especially integral conversation to have with Google Stadia on the horizon, a forward-thinking device from one of Earth's biggest companies that aims to deliver purely streaming gaming content to an audience that simply might not be ready or able to receive it. Frankly put, America's internet sucks, and our government openly agrees. The 2018 Federal Communications Commission International Broadband Data Report reveals that we come in 10th place when our broadband speeds are compared to other developed nations. We often speak of American exceptionalism, but our internet, like other pieces of vital American infrastructure, is far from exceptional. Unless, of course, you count the exceptional costs we pay for subpar service. After all, Americans pay more for online service than virtually any other citizen of any other country in the world. Not helping matters is that 90% of Americans only have access to a single high-capacity provider. This form of shared wink-and-a-nod monopolism has created an environment where no one is trying to undersell the other, improve services, or compete on an open market, keeping costs high for increasingly diminishing returns. Like rival gangs that would rather make money in their territory than fight for another's. Competing internet service providers just don't encroach on another's turf. So instead of raising profits by growing in size and reach, the major internet service providers, or ISPs, continually raise prices on their consumers, and consumers have nowhere to turn. To spell this out further, some of the largest American ISPs are Charter Spectrum, Comcast Xfinity, Verizon, and AT&T, and none of their respective territory overlaps. Spectrum and Xfinity offer no competing services anywhere at all, and even AT&T and Verizon don't overlap with any last-mile wired services. What that means is they share wires that crisscross everywhere except where it matters to consumers most, and that is the connections that plug into their homes. Some households, often in wealthier areas, are immensely lucky and have a choice of a fiber connection. This option allows for the absolute best internet available. To give an example of just how powerful fiber is, the underwater cables that connect China's internet to the United States features just 8 individual strands of the synthetic glass, and this allows for a data transfer of untold proportions. Just one single filament is enough to carry over 3 billion phone calls. Yet sadly, for as great as fiber is, very few homes have access. Only 10 million American households subscribe to fiber-based ISPs, which may sound like a lot, but not when compared to the other 109 million households that don't. In fact, 75% of all census blocks have zero access to this wonderfully speedy on-ramp to the net. That's a lot of neighborhoods being underserved, a stat that becomes even more depressing when one learns how fiber is transforming other nations around the world. As Susan Crawford expresses within her book Fiber, this high-speed network is as potentially transformative to our culture as the dawn of the electric age was in the 19th century. As other countries who have adopted fiber in full can attest, it's changing things at a radical clip. That's because a fiber connection can download roughly 5 gigabytes of data in less than 30 seconds. In the United States, the FCC labels high-speed access as 25 megabits per second, a speed which would take over 30 minutes to download the same 5 gigs of data. Outside of fiber connections, when taking into account other forms of high-capacity lines, the picture still isn't pretty. 53% of census blocks that maintain a housing unit of some form have not a single ISP offering speeds of 50 megabits per second or more. Within rural areas, 58% of census blocks have no access to speeds of even just 25 megabits per second. Making things extra fuzzy is that in census blocks where better internet is available, it doesn't necessarily equate to better web access to those who live in such areas. Every 6 months, a report is filed to the FCC on behalf of all the major internet service providers to let the government agency know where they've deployed last-mile wires. This process isn't thorough, though, and the FCC doesn't do much to check the accuracy of the reporting. But worse still, thanks to what's called the one-served, all-served assumption, ISPs can say a particular census block is served even if just a single location has access. Census blocks come in all sizes, but they're typically smaller in cities and larger rural areas. And thanks to the all-served assumption, a business in a portion of a city might have high-speed internet access, and even if not a single line extends anywhere else, it's determined that a particular area is wired with quality internet. It's backwards and blatantly misleading, to say the least. There's a massive gap between those with internet access and those without, and this is referred to as the digital divide. In many cases, this is in reference to rural people who have no true options when it comes to quality broadband. But location isn't the only thing limiting some folks. Of individuals making less than $20,000 a year, 60% don't have wired internet access. There have been plans to bring better internet to those living a classically rural American life, but often these ventures have failed. A third of the US population, 123 million people, are in most cases stuck with what can only be considered subpar internet. In regard to people with decent to good internet, data caps are still prevalent in most locations. Many ISPs give subscribers a monthly allotment of 1,024 gigabytes, also known as a terabyte, though some internet users get even less data than that per month. Go over whatever the cap is, and extra charges are to be expected, along with speed throttling. Worse yet, for those wanting an unlimited plan, there is a fairly high fee to attain it. To some people, a monthly data cap of a terabyte may sound like more than is necessary, and many households probably never come close to hitting it, but internet usage varies, especially when streaming. To highlight how a data cap can be used, consider that just 1 hour of Netflix HD streaming is about 3 gigs per hour, a number that can be doubled or tripled if streaming in 4K resolution. Or consider downloading patches for a video game. When Call of Duty Black Ops 4 launched in the fall of 2018, it had a day one patch that came in at a gargantuan 55 gigs, required just to play the game. Given all that, on top of the other things we use the net for, it's easy to see how data caps can be reached incredibly fast. Yet, between data usage and ailing speeds, we're somehow supposed to believe video game streaming is ready for mainstream consumer use. Enter Google Stadia. Announced during the Game Developer Conference keynote speech on March 19, 2019, Stadia is a cloud-based gaming platform which Google hopes will disrupt the home console market by offering high-end gaming experiences without the need for an expensive piece of dedicated hardware. It has no set-top box or console, and instead runs on desktop computers, laptops, tablets, Chromecast Ultra TV streaming sticks, and Google Pixel 3 phones, with a promise to work on iPhones and other devices further down the line. With the exception of the internet-capable devices you probably already own, the only other necessary hardware component for the platform is a controller, of which end users will have a few options. The service is slated to accept various USB controllers when playing on mobile or browser, negating the need to buy something new for those who already own something they like. However, this doesn't extend to playing on a TV, and gamers relying on Chromecast Ultras will indeed need to shell out $70 for the new controller manufactured by Google. Stadia is set to release during November, and with a fairly strong launch library in tow, including Ghost Recon Breakpoint, Doom Eternal, Borderlands 3, and quite a few other titles. It will first launch in 14 countries including, but not limited to, the United States, Italy, Ireland, Canada, Sweden, and Germany, though Stadia's launch doesn't include every territory of each country, as it will not be available in Hawaii, the Virgin Islands, or Guam, for instance. When considering the poor internet quality on the islands, it makes sense why Google isn't yet ready to invest in them. For gamers looking for a streaming experience, Google's new platform is definitely gearing up to fill that niche, and the company is no doubt setting some lofty goals to draw people in. Whether this is hype or not remains to be seen, but it's been claimed that Stadia is able to outperform the Xbox One X and PS4 Pro, with an expectation that its performance can be further doubled. Google's VP of Engineering even proclaimed during the aforementioned GDC presentation that Stadia will eventually achieve 8K resolution and 120 frames per second. Never mind that 4K is still far from the norm for most households. You know, the whole internet speed thing. To tie into the online experience, Google is building Stadia with the web in mind. The official controller has a button dedicated to capturing and sharing gameplay, like the DualShock 4, and another button for a Google Assistant, which is designed around scouring the net to provide tips for players who get stuck while playing. On the social front, Stadia can connect to YouTube to stream videos to those who enjoy watching Let's Plays and the like. A unique feature in this case is that spectators no longer need to be just that. A play button on YouTube will allow players to jump into a game on Stadia, even if only as spectators. This is called the State Share feature. It remains to be seen just how popular this will be given a Stadia subscription is necessary, as well as owning the game being played. It's also worth noting that Sony hyped up a similar, albeit stripped-down feature for PlayStation 4 that was and has been scarcely used. Stadia's subscription model alone might be enough to turn some early adopters off. There is a free version called Stadia Base, but it only allows streaming up to resolutions of 1080p and a sound format limited to stereo. For those who want up to 4K resolutions and 5.1 surround sound, it's going to cost $9.99 a month. That's called Stadia Pro. There is also a Founders Edition for those who plan on jumping aboard the hype train early at a cost of $129.99. This includes 3 months of Stadia Pro, a Chromecast Ultra, Destiny 2, a limited edition controller, and a few other odds and ends, including a pass that'll allow a friend 3 months access to Pro. Everything is set to be powered by data centers Google has scattered around the globe. These take up residency in over 200 countries and territories. But is that going to be enough to maintain a consistent connection for a gaming medium that requires a never-ending online presence? Only time will tell, but the current state of the internet might suggest it's worth hanging on to physical consoles for at least the next generation. According to Google, users will need internet speeds of 10 megabits per second for 720p resolution and 35 megabits per second for 4K HDR. Just to hit 1080p requires 20 megabits per second. For some, that's easily attainable, but as already discussed, for much of the US and other parts of the world, attaining consistent speeds at that level is completely unthinkable. This glaring issue was addressed by Google's Vice President Phil Harrison when he said that, quote, "data caps are not a universal challenge," end quote. He later added, quote, "The ISPs have a strong history of staying ahead of consumer trends, and if you look at the history of data caps in those small number of markets, and it's actually a relatively small number of markets that have data caps, the trend over time when music streaming and download became popular, data caps moved up. Then with the evolution of TV and film streaming, data caps moved up, and we expect that will continue to be the case." Google is essentially saying the ISPs will take care of us. There's no issue because Big Papa Monopoly will look out for our well-being. Snark aside, this statement is alarming because it shows just how out of touch a Google VP can be. Data caps within the United States are not rare, and over the years they have been increasingly showing up inside more and more regions. The claim that they are just limited to a small number of markets is patently false. When further pressed on the notion of data caps, Phil Harrison responded thusly, quote, "I've seen the math calculations that people have done. If you take 35 megabits per second, it's not always 35 because we use compression. There will be some times when actually it's using significantly less data than that, and so it's not correct to multiply 35 megabits per second by the number of seconds that you play," end quote. The conversation came up after gaming publication PC Gamer crunched the numbers and revealed that just 65 hours of 4K gaming would eat up the earlier mentioned terabyte of data most ISPs limit their customers to. This rises to 113 hours for those who stream at 1080p. The Stadia launch library is largely composed of games that clock in at well over 50 hours, even more so when considering the live service aspect of some of them, and the multiplayer components of the others. Some of this might be negated by those who play via cell networks. As PUBG or Fortnite have shown, there's actually a massive core gaming market on mobile phones, but these games are still downloaded to a device first, whereas Stadia is only streamed. Lose signal for a second and the experience becomes sloppy. Current 4G networks also might not be reliable enough. There's a hope 5G can save the day, but don't hold your breath. 5G still requires a fiber network to connect each cell tower, and this means that fiber will need to be extended into more locations, an expensive and complicated prospect to say the least. To give an idea of just how costly building a 5G network will be, when 4G first emerged, Verizon had to build 30,000 base stations to cover the majority of the United States. 5G, on the other hand, would require 10 million. That's an absurd number, so unlike 4G, 5G won't be built to cover the entire nation. This is due to the differing high-frequency wavelengths. The higher the frequency, the less distance it can travel. 5G in its current state is also poor at penetrating walls and windows, so again, we shouldn't expect it to fix this problem. Another area where Google faces serious problems is in the all-important realm of latency. As reported on once again by PC Gamer, the Stadia has not yet proven it's up to the task. While writing about their hands-on impressions, PC Gamer reported that bad latency got the journalist killed in-game while testing the service out. To break down the technical aspects of this for those who aren't quite sure what this means, latency, also known as ping, is the travel time between controller button prompts, a server, and back. Play most multiplayer games and you'll see a visualization of ping rates next to each player's name. The lower the latency, the better the experience, especially within fast-paced games, multiplayer shooters, or competitive titles such as Rocket League. If latency gets too high, online experiences become laggy messes. For a streaming service, it becomes even more imperative that latency is under control, given it'll now affect single-player games as well. Imagine playing a complicated platformer like Super Meat Boy and not having your button prompts register when they should. Who knows, maybe Google will in fact have things under control when Stadia launches later this fall, but given the degradation of last-mile internet infrastructure, it seems unlikely it's ready for prime time or anywhere close. Many of the connections that enter our home are still run through outdated copper wiring, and this creates a bottleneck as data transitions from fiber to coaxial cable. That doesn't mean Stadia can't work, it probably just won't work anywhere as well as designed or intended, making it a tough sell to those who are already used to the ease of console gaming. I have no doubt in my mind that Stadia will find an audience. There will be people who latch onto the service and adore it, but I struggle to see it making a meaningful splash comparable to that of the current trifecta of major console manufacturers. PlayStation offers a streaming service in PlayStation Now on PlayStation 4, and Xbox has both the awesome Netflix of games known as Games Pass and their upcoming streaming service, Project xCloud. And given the PlayStation 4 alone just topped 100 million units sold, I just don't see traditional console gaming taking a hit anytime soon. As of now, the Microsofts, Sonys, and Nintendos of the world offer something for everyone with fewer limitations. The Stadia can only be played online, and given the costs associated with it, including the potential for needing to pay your ISP a higher fee just to have access to more data, it appears Google has a Sisyphean task ahead of it. That alone should have consumers worried. None of this necessarily suggests Stadia is a guaranteed failure, but if our current infrastructure is to have a say, Google Stadia might become as forgotten to the average consumer as Google Glass.